Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hope you guys are all doing well. I hope you're enjoying your labs. I hope you're enjoying these lectures. So today we're going to dive into community ecology and us, how humans influence community dynamics. And so we're going to start off with a sort of a really nice example of how humans can directly affect nature and how they influence how communities um, interact and how they change. So we're going to talk about a case in the 70s in the Adirondack Lakes up in upstate New York. It's a really beautiful area of New York if you've never been there. Lots and lots of lakes, lots of trees, mountains, very, very beautiful area. Uh, the mystery in the 70s there was that scientists became very alarmed when several fish species started to disappear from hundreds of lakes in the Adirondack Mountains. In addition, they were seeing scientists tested the water and found highly acidified lakes. So, what is acidification? What does an acidified lake mean? Well, this all ties to pH, and the pH, at its most sort of simple version, refers to how acidic something is. In sort of the most technical term, it's the concentration of hydrogen ions. You don't really need to know that second one, but just to know it's a measure of how acidic something is. So a pH of 0 is very, very acidic. pH of 14 is what we call very, very basic. So it's the opposite of acidic. And a pH of 7 is what we call neutral. So it's a 0 to 14 scale. Now, the important thing to note about the pH scale is not just all these interesting things like, seltzer is about a pH of 2.5, or, seawater is pH of 8. It's not all these, common everyday things. It's that this pH scale is actually log. And what do I mean by log? Well, again, I told you it refers to the concentration of hydrogen ions. And so as we go down on the pH scale from 7 to 6, it's not just a change of 1, it's a change of tenfold. So that when we go from 7 to 6, it's a 10 times higher concentration of hydrogen ions at 6 than it is in 7. And conversely, as we go from 7 to 8, it's 10 times less hydrogen ions at 8 relative to 7. So the important thing to know about the pH scale is that small changes are meaningful because it's a log scale. And just to put this in further perspective about this, the pH of your blood is about 7.4. If the pH of your blood dropped to 7.0, so neutral, you would die in a few hours. So just put that in perspective of how small changes can have meaningful effects. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the Adirondacks. So they measured the pH in 3,000 at lakes in the Adirondacks, and between 20 to 40% were presently acidified. So as I mentioned, neutral pH is 7. Rainwater is a pH of 5.6, so it's slightly acidic. And this is due because the water reacts with CO2 to create an acid called carbonic acid. This is also the acid in like sodas and seltzers that make them acidic as well, just as a note, if you're a seltzer fan like me. Um, the medium pH of rainwater in the Northeast in this Adirondack area was actually 4.3. So again, the normal pH of rain is 5.6. The pH of rain in the Adirondack area was 4.3. Remember, this is a log scale, so it's a 10-fold change between normal rain and the rain of the Adirondacks. When they measured the pH of the lakes, they had a pH of about 5. And that's not good. So the lakes are acidified. Why do we care? And how do they get acidified? So let's talk about how they get acidified, and then we'll talk about why we care about this. So the answer to this question is simple, but not so simple. It's coal-burning power plants. And you might think, well, there's not a whole lot of coal-burning power plants in the Adirondacks. The reality of it is pollution is not just a point issue, right? If I pollute in Michigan, it doesn't just stay in Michigan. It goes all around Michigan. And in the case here, we had the coal burning power plants in the Midwest. So when you burn coal, you release nitrogen oxides, so that's denoted by NOx, and sulfur dioxides that mix with rainwater and form two very potent acids, nitric and sulfuric acid. Now, once these get into the atmosphere, they can be carried hundreds of miles by rainstorms, by wind currents, by anything, and they fall down as acidified liquids, as snow, rain, dust, sleet, or hail. And the major source for the Adirondacks was actually the Midwest. The answer to the question is why? Well, the Midwest is very industrialized, and so they have a lot of coal-fired power plants, especially historically. Less so now, but they still have lots of fossil fuel-powered plants there, which creates a lot of this, and it gets carried to the Adirondacks. And so the interesting thing about the Adirondacks is that a lot of places have rock that are associated with them that acts as a buffer, so it limits the amount of pH change. But the fact of the matter is that the surface geology, granite in New York State as a whole, has minimal capacity to buffer a pH change. So here in Massachusetts, we have lots of limestone, and that has a pretty good capacity to buffer pH changes in natural systems. So all this coal-burning power plants were driving these sort of acidified liquids, rain, sleet, snow, hail, things like that, to the Adirondacks from the Midwest. So I like this quote from the Adirondack Council. They say, the worst of our problems began in the 70s when federal officials ordered coal-fired power plants to clean up air quality in their home states. Midwest plants built very tall smokestacks that allowed winds to carry most of their pollution away, but a way turned out to be right here in the Adirondack Park. We are situated just downwind of the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes, where the largest number of coal-fired plants are located. So air pollution and moisture reach here first. And I hope this really illustrates that, pollution, environmental issues aren't just a sort of a one state thing, right? They are wide reaching overall, which is why groups like the EPA are really, really important, because they help regulate things across borders, because pollution doesn't give a crap about borders, very much kind of like COVID doesn't give a crap about borders. But I digress. So what are the effects of this? So we said it's coming from the Midwest. What is it doing to our living stocks of organisms, right? How is it harming our fish? Well, at a pH of 6.5, brook brown and juvenile rainbow trout have reduced egg hatchability. At a pH 5.5, bass, walleye, and rainbow trout eventually just die. At a pH less than survive, few fish species can physically survive. Now, if you remember back from a few slides ago, the pH of the lakes was a pH of about 5. So we're at 5 or less. What is going on here? Well, there's a couple things. Why? First is low pH directly interferes with the physiology. In particular, it directly interferes with the physiology of salt balance. Salt is a very important mineral for all organisms that have muscles, involved with muscle contraction, breathing, things like that. You change the pH, you change how salt is sort of cycled through an organism. If you change that, you'll die. Right. So think about if you drank seawater, you eventually would die, or first you go blind, then you die from seawater, because you just can't handle all the salt. So if you change how salt is cycled in an individual, they die. But the other thing it does is, as you acidify water, it actually mobilizes aluminum, and not just aluminum, but also mobilizes mercury and cadmium. And these are toxic elements. So if there's in high enough concentration, aluminum, mercury, and cadmium are toxic, with cadmium and mercury being much more toxic than aluminum. Aluminum, as it says here, is the third most abundant mineral in Earth. It is the most abundant mineral on Earth. It is the third most abundant compound in the Earth, the crust of the Earth, I should say. And so it's really, really common. And so you liberate mercury and cadmium, by acidifying the soils in these rivers, lakes, and ponds. And those are our fish, and that's important economically for the area, and touristy things and things like that. But fish aren't the only ones that are affected. So we can look at these lake communities as a whole. And so when we say community in an ecological sense, it's just population. So remember, a population is just one species living in a defined area. So a community is multiple populations of different species living in a defined area and interacting within the same physical environment. And so you can look at the critical pH level for some aquatic organisms, including snails, clams, bass, salamanders, perch, right, different types of fish, and insects. But you see that, a couple of things I'd like to point out here. You see some animals can go lower, so frogs and certain types of fish can go lower, so the acidification wasn't having a direct impact on them. But the important thing is I'm so sorry about that. You're seeing sort of interesting. So the first is high pHs of snails and clams. So these have shells. And so shelled organisms at lower pHs have a very difficult time forming their shells. This is actually what we see with ocean acidification as well. Clams, corals, things like that have a very hard time forming shells at more acidic pHs. But you're also seeing direct effects not just on big things, but on very small things like insects. So mayflies are a type of insect. And you can imagine if you're affecting insects with the pH, well, maybe you're affecting the food that bigger things eat, in addition to affecting their just straight physiology. And so what this gets us to is how pollution affects interspecific and intraspecific species level interactions. So this is just a handy table for you. We have species 1, species 2, 0 is no effect, a plus is a positive effect, and the minus sign is obviously a negative effect. So we have no interaction, which is a double 0. We have allelopathy, which is one of the more interesting types of interactions where it has no effect on one species, but negatively affects another species. So for those of you that have ever tried to grow plants in an area that had plants before it, one of the things that happens with plants is they release chemicals into the soil to inhibit other plants, and so it makes it hard for other plants to grow. Now, the interesting is it doesn't benefit the plant that's releasing the chemicals at all, but directly impacts the other type of plant. Just as a note, if you ever struggled, it might be growing a garden, it might be because of allelopathy. We have commensalism, where one organism benefits but the other doesn't. A great example of this is like a water buffalo in Africa and the birds that live on top of them. The water buffalo isn't benefited, it doesn't harmed, but the birds that live on top of water buffalo get some pretty great benefits from it. Next, we have mutualism. That's a plus and plus. So that's like me and my dog. You know, my dog gets food and shelter. I get love from my dog. That's mutualism. Both benefit. We have competition, where neither benefit. So, if my dogs are going for the same bone, they're both losing out because they're competing against each other for that same bone. So they're expending energy, they're expending time, they're expending resources. We have predation, where one individual eats another. I think that's pretty straightforward. One benefits, the other's not so much. And then we have parasitism, which is where one benefits and the other does not. And parasitism falls into two categories. It can be an endoparasitism, parasite, when you're living inside another organism. So think of a tapeworm, right? The tapeworm is harming you by taking your nutrients, but it's doing pretty good for itself because it's eating. This is in contrast to an ectoparasite. This would be something like a tick, fleas, things like that live on the sort of physical surface of an animal. But again, parasites are directly impacting the physiology and the biology of any given host that they're on. As a note, with parasites, they seem kind of gross, but they're actually really, really important. There's some interesting math out there that estimates that there's 1,000 parasites for every species on the planet, but they are important, as we saw in the last lecture, for density-dependent factors. So just as a note, they're gross to think about, but they are important for population structure. Now, with those out of the way, you can actually use individuals as what we call bioindicators. And so trout and other fishes are used as indicator because they're they're responsive and they're much more sensitive to human activities than other ones. So the idea being, we can use trout or any of the other bioindicator species to see how the health of an ecosystem. So in Massachusetts here, we pretty commonly use specific types of insects in our streams and our lakes and stuff like that to understand how healthy our lakes are, because indicator species are much more susceptible to changes induced by humans. So if you see them go away, you know something's wrong with your lake. And so we can actually use another type of indicator species, which would be something that benefits from humans being bad. And this includes black flies. And so I've never actually personally been bit by a black fly, but I've been bitten by a fly that's very closely related to a black fly. And I can tell you they hurt like hell. These black flies love acidified lakes. So they are bioindicators because they go crazy in the presence of acidified lakes. And what happens? Well, it causes more biting, right, including us. And so you can ask yourself, what type of interaction is this? And, in terms of interactions, it fits on sort of the predation level here. It also kind of fits on its parasitic level. You could sort of argue either way, just as a note. And this is what their fly bites look like. Like I said, they hurt like hell from what I've been told. So. But as I mentioned, we can use bioindicator species to understand how the effects are human-induced things are affecting our ecosystems. But Population pollution itself can affect food webs. And these are what we basically call energy pathways that are connecting organisms. Now, food is just energy, right? You might eat a sweet Chipotle burrito, but you take that burrito and you break it down to get the chemical energy out of the food to power you on an everyday basis. And so food webs, again, are just linkages of these food chains depicting energy movement. Now, this includes also what we call trophic levels. And these are feeding levels in a food chain, i.e. a producer or a photosynthetic organism or a consumer or a predator. And then we have also top-down and bottom-up food webs. We'll get into those two in a moment. But I just like to sort of show you a simplified lake food web where it all starts with the primary producing ones. So they take energy from the light, so plants and algae, as well as microorganisms, which aren't included in this sort of taking energy from the sun. But they are. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you they were. They take energy from the sun, and then they're consumed by something, which is then consumed by something bigger, which is consumed by something bigger. And then when everything dies, it eventually goes into this pool of things that like to eat dead things, including microorganisms. And again, you notice that it's pretty heavily interconnected. This is simplified. These things can get much more complicated overall. But again, it's just a web of how things are put together, how things interact. Because you can imagine there's all sorts of positive and negative interactions or no interactions spread throughout this overall food web. And so we can look at how these food webs, give me one sec, folks. I really apologize. My dog needs to be taken care of. Give me one moment. Okay, I'm back. I apologize for that. Though I feel like you guys probably get used to it on my recorded lectures by the end of the course. But I digress. Now, as I mentioned, there's two different ways food webs control themselves, and it's through top-down and bottom-up bottom-up controls. Now, top-down controls, I think, are by far the sort of the more complex of the two. So let's talk first about these bottom-up controls. Not just because they're on the left; they're much more simple. The idea being is bottom-up controls are regulated by resources. So if I have lots of resources, in the case of the bottom of every food chain pretty much is going to be photosynthetic organisms. So lots and lots of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. If I have lots and lots of nitrogen and phosphorus, I increase the biomass of my primary producers. If there's more primary producers, that means there's going to be more zooplankton feeding on them. There's going to be more fish feeding on those zooplankton and more larger things feeding on those fish. So you can see just simple by stimulating the physicals, the chemical nature of the system. We can stimulate our primary producers, and by stimulating the primary producers, we stimulate the biomass of everything else. So this is why it's called bottom-up controls. This is in contrast to top-down controls, which is regulated by consumers. So when we have high population together positively. This one, some go down, others go up. So as you decrease the amount of big predators, the things that they eat go up, but the things that they eat go up, the things that the zooplankton that these guys are eating go down because there's more predation, and as zooplankton go down, the more phytoplankton there is. So these are how food web populations are controlled, either through the interactions by consumers or by our resources overall. Just as a note, the vast majority of ecosystems on the planet are controlled by bottom-up processes. Top-down processes aren't that common. They do exist, don't get me wrong, but most of the time you're seeing bottom-up processes. And so one of the sort of interesting things about nature is we have this really interesting group of individuals on the planet, which we call a Keystone species. And these are species that other species heavily depend on. And if you remove that one species, it would fundamentally alter and change an ecosystem. And a great example of this is a beaver. So beavers are ecosystem keystone species, but they're also what we call ecosystem engineers because they're the only species on the planet that make structures like humans do. I mean, you have other things like ants and stuff like that, and termites, but nothing quite like a beaver dam, because beaver dams can be miles long. They're crazy. So they are ecosystem engineers, but they are keystone species. And how are they keystone species? Well, they dam the water, which changes the water flow. And when you change that water flow, you create ponds and weird streams and stuff like that. It allows different plants to grow. And when it allows different plants to go, it changes the macroinvertebrates, so the insects and stuff like that, which changes the fish present. But it all wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the beavers. And if you remove the beaver dam, all the things that follow the beaver dam would completely disappear. And so this is why we call it a keystone species, because if you remove it, you dramatically affect everything else. The other classical example here is actually a sea otter. So I linked this article down here of the California otter. Take a peek at it. It's actually kind of interesting. Read about how important sea otters were to the kelp ecosystems across the way. But as I mentioned, they do structure species. Now, another example of this is from a paper in 2018 looking at the brown bear. So the brown bear eats the salmon, but the effects of the salmon actually the effects of the brown bear aren't just limited on the salmon. It's actually affects directly the trees. The sort of interesting thing here is that the bears are taking nutrients and materials from the salmon, and they poop in the woods. Right? You've heard that old adage, does a bear, crap in the woods? Answer to that is yes. So the bears are taking the nutrients from the salmon, bringing it to land, stimulating the trees, which stimulate a bunch of other stuff. So again, you have this one animal eating one source, but again, having a pretty large effect on the whole ecosystem. But not all species interactions are negative. And so humans naturally invite groups of species that like to be around us, that like to live in our destructive environments. So we have a sort of a definition here. We have what we call a cosmopolitan species. This is a species with a very wide distribution, and it's found in many parts of the world. The best example of this is things that come with us, mice and rats. Those are cosmopolitan species. You find them everywhere. You find them even on Antarctica, like in the military bases and scientific outposts down there. You still find them there. They're everywhere. Now, sort of an interesting thing, when you introduce some of these species, and we'll talk about this concept later, if you introduce them to an area that they weren't before, well, they become non-native or invasive. So cosmopolitan species typically, can become invasive or non-native when they enter a new area. Now, urban environments are what are inviting sort of interesting groups of species that take advantage of our spaces, but these aren't negative interactions, right? You think about the pigeon, you think about the rat, right? Those aren't negative interactions for the rats. The rats and the pigeons are doing great because of humans, because they provide this new home, this new environment, right? We predict by 2045 that there'll be 6 billion of us living in urban environments, which means there's going to be a lot more urban habitat, which is going to invite lots and lots of new organisms to our cities. And many plants and animals are showing rapid evolution and adaptation to actually living in urban environments. And the answer to this question of why is there's fewer predators, there's a lot of food, and the food that is there is very, very calorie dense, as I'm sure you guys all know. Humans like to eat very fatty food and very sugary food. And there's also the potential for increased habitat availability. And you can see this with any number of species, whether it's an ant, a squirrel, a rat, a raccoon, a falcon, a pigeon, a coyote. Any number of different animals have taken advantage of living and benefited from living by humans. And it's actually kind of interesting. The Dr. Elizabeth Stoner, who's the other faculty member at Bentley that teaches the third section of this class, she actually has a visitor that they've nicknamed Rhonda. It's just a raccoon. But it comes to the house, it tries to steal food, it ransacks their garbage. So it has adapted to living with these humans, even though Dr. S is not living in an urban environment, but she's living in a suburban environment overall. But animals themselves are learning to live with us, and they actually tend to be doing better than their wild cousins. They typically, when they're living around humans, they live longer, reproduce more than wild counterparts due to more resources and less predation. Now, it may not be something that's evolutionary, because many of this stuff is new, but it does seem to be this really interesting changes in their physiology. And so you can, just an example of this, if you look at a pigeon, right, sort of the gross pigeons you see around Boston. Well, they're not gross. They're just kind of just Boston pigeons. I wouldn't say they're gross. But you have Boston pigeons. They're wild cousins same species is doves, right? Doves look nice, they're elegant looking, right? No one has anything bad to say about doves. But again, you can see these two, the same species, one lives in the city, one lives in the suburbs. Very, very different. And and so part of living in the city is navigating this, right? And navigating humans, navigating traffic, navigating our buildings, and passing that knowledge on to your offspring. And what this has actually led to is some animals are becoming craftier. So for instance, there's this really interesting paper from 2013 looking at Antillean bullfinches that have learned how to open sugar packets so that they can eat the sugar, which, is pretty crafty, right? Sugar is a pretty concentrated energy source. Now, given that animals are doing better in cities, does this mean we should build more cities? No, but we do need to acknowledge that we do exist as part of the community, right? As I've mentioned before, we are not distinct from nature. And we have to maximize sort of our land, but also natural lands, but also the land that is human, directly interacting with humans. And this includes cities. Now, this has led to people designing green parks, trees, rooftops to attract more organisms, to attract more natural organisms. But again, we shouldn't be building more cities at all. We should be trying to, preserve natural areas as physically as much as we can and building less cities. So with that, that's going to be the end of this lecture for the day. I hope you guys learned a little something. And again, as always, please let me know if you have any questions at all. And I hope you guys are all doing very well. And please, again, any questions on the material, on your labs, please let me know. Take care, guys.